Hey, thank you. Hey, good morning, everyone. So, if you look at the panel, we had a lot of good experts. And if you look at the word NHI, it was used more than 50 plus times. So, today, if you look at most of the topics which we spoke, the good thing is we had a lot of good people talked about different things. You're going to see them repeated again and again, which is good because it means that if different kinds of people are looking at the problem and saying the same things, that means that there is something really everybody has to address. So with that, I'm Kamal. I'm the co-founder and the CTO of Andromeda Security. And before this, I was running the Cloud Center of Excellence at PayPal. With that, let me start. I thought since it's a first session, I thought I'll start with a little bit of why NHI is such a big thing and has created such a hype, right? So this is, I think the axiom, the part of covered it. Humans is a problem which has been dealt a lot before, and it's been centralized. Like if you started 25 years back, there was like so many systems which has different human identities and they had users created everywhere, and then started coming into a concept of centralization. So you have IDPs today, right? And you have systems which are dealing with humans, and it is more tackled, but still it's vulnerable. So if you look at number of hacks which happen, not everything is NHI. Most of the hacks, there is also human based because of social engineering, everything. Still there is a problems, but at least you can list out what needs to be solved, because there is maximum, it's a username password, and then you have multi-factor, which is also can be listed what kind of things, and you can deal with it. So still manageable, but vulnerable, right? But when you go to non-human identities, it's completely decentralized. You take even just one cloud, like let's say AWS or Azure, how many types of NHI exist? It's even hard for people who are working day in, day out to count it and keep track of it, because each service comes up with its own mechanisms, like its own API keys, no service accounts, you name it, right? It exists so much, and there is no centralization, no standardization. There's no one way of authentication also, right? It's completely defragmented and decentralized, and there's nothing has been done because things are evolving so fast. And you take one cloud, it's like that. If you put cloud plus all your SaaS applications plus your own application at home in your companies, it explodes. And that's why it's very complicated to handle NHIs, right? So second thing is, most of you talked about it, right? We are in a world where everybody wants to be independent and move fast. And especially with the DevOps model, we give access to developers, and developers goes and do their job to get the business done. Right or wrong is a different thing, but they are given access to create things in their own. When they create, when you're talking about security, which is normally controlled, let's say a human enters a company, you have a very clear defined process through your IGA, where a person is created, it's managed, and everybody knows what that person has access to. But NHI doesn't have any of those centralized process or pipeline, right? So that's where it is very difficult to track. Now, there is one important thing is, I think somebody in the panel mentioned it, there's a very clear tie-up. Who creates this NHIs? Even if I come and ask, in your company, which person has created the most NHIs, or who has created the keys and left it for years? If you don't know, if a person created the key and they left the company, do you know whether they have access to the keys yet or not? It's very hard. So it's very important to tie that, saying that the life cycle of the humans in the company and the NHI is also tied in a way. And there is lot of aspects which is there, but I'll cover them in one by one. So I think, as I said, it's very defragmented. There's a lot of things happening in the NHI, but we tried to bring that together in a generalized concept. So if you take a non-human identity, what is that if you want to do? If you want to look at it in a way that what to focus, right? What to prioritize? We divided this into a more simplified diagram. So you take any target system. It could be a cloud, it could be a SaaS, it could be. And in that, you have resources, right? You have systems with, let's say, in AWS, you have S3 or a cloud compute, whatever it is. And you need an application. So end of the day, why you create an NHI? You have an application, and the application has to do a job, and which means that it has to keep running 24/7 and doing something, which means it needs access to those resources. Those accesses what we define as entitlements, which is nothing but permissions or roles, whatever this particular system calls. And then you give it to that a name, like humans, like my name is Kamal, you give an NHI called ABC, those entitlements, and let them access those resources. This is pretty much a generalized concept. It doesn't matter whether it's GitHub, AWS, GCP, you have the same thing. Then you take that credential, because a credential is nothing but a way to say I am approve my authentication, right? For an NHI, it could be just a API key, it could be an access key, it could be an SSH key, doesn't matter. Or a username password too, because there's still systems which use a username password for NHIs. So you give the credentials of the client application, the client authentication authenticates, and then uses that authorization to do work on it. This is pretty much, I could say that 90% cases are covered. There are still maybe exceptions, but we have that. Now, if you take those pieces, there are three things: credentials, clients, and entitlements. Now, let's focus on each of them. I think you have a lot of experts today who are talking about it. And even though each of us are looking at it in a different way, end of the day, the problem we are trying to solve is how to protect all of these. And I think there's a lot of talks. I looked at it, which is going to deal about secrets. So I'll spend less time and focus on other aspects. But the main things about a credential, as I said, there is so many types of credentials, right? I think we may know, even I worked on all the three clouds and so many SaaS in my previous job, but still I don't think I know every single service account which exists in every single system. So the types of credentials, like the API keys, SSH keys, PKIs, I can keep listing. There is so many, which means that having a knowledge of what types of keys, how to rotate them, how to protect them, how they are used is very critical. And it's very hard for somebody in an enterprise whose focus is not that to do this, because people keep creating based on the need. Let's say somebody wants to use a GenAI service, let's say Vertex AI. They go ahead and do that, right? And they will just create one and start using it. Who is going to keep track of that? How it has to be rotated? What's the governance policy around it? That's a major challenge. Second is duration. I think somebody talked about his static credentials. Basically, it's nothing but short-lived and long-lived, right? So most of the cloud today has a simple way for you to use short-lived credentials, which means that the credential is managed by the cloud provider, right? Or they rotate it for you. They inject it into your system so that you can use. One of the best practices, I hope most of a security expert will say, is don't use long credentials, use short-lived credentials, and especially which are not exposed to you, right? But there is still gaps in this. I'll talk about it in the next slide. But that is a best practice or a better practice than having a long-lived credentials. And then we have rotation. So I think there's a lot of emphasis on rotation, but I just wanted to give a practical experience of managing thousands of applications in PayPal. It's very fragile, right? We had a fully automated system where you rotate a credential, we'll push it into a vault, application reads from the vault, everything is automated. Still, it's only 50% of the applications were all in the standard framework. So everybody don't have a mechanism to fetch these credentials. Some application has to be restarted. Some application doesn't have a way to go to the vault because it doesn't use the standard framework. That means they need a credential to access the framework. So there are challenges in doing this, but it is very critical that you keep rotating it. And somebody said, leaving a credential which is known to be vulnerable for 5 days is giving 5 days somebody access to your whole system, right? So it has to be protected. It has to be done, but there are challenges with that. And then last is vaulting. Vaulting is very critical. Even for a end user, right? For a human who needs access to production, the credentials should be in a vault, which they should check in, check out, and then when they check in, it should be rotated. In that way, it is pretty much controlled that these things are managed securely. So the best way to do this is, some of the best practices, use short-lived. Wherever the credential is not exposed to any humans, it's all system. And then try to basically, if you have a long-lived credential, because there's still, I would say 30 to 40% of the systems or third parties where you cannot use this short-lived because it has to be inside the cloud. If you're outside the cloud or you're doing development from your desktop, you can't avoid it. So there is no way to completely avoid it, but it's better to be using the best practices there by rotating them, storing them in the right places. So with that, and this third last point, I would say that we don't have full control on most of these things, because once you give a credential to a third party, they are using it. If you rotate it, it breaks. So there is also a business impact to it. So just to be aware of that when you're doing it. Then comes the client, right? This is very important because a lot of times what happens is you created a credentials, and that credential, you created a cloud is used creating it or doing, but where is this, it is getting access from? I'll give a simple example. Let's say in AWS, you have an EC2 instance, and most of you know that there is something called as an instance profile, which is basically injecting into the VM. If you ask most of the people, it is secure because nobody gets access to the credential, it is inside everything. But we had seen attacks where if there is an attacker in your system somehow, right, able to get in, you can access the metadata server, which is endpoint, and get the credential and use it. AWS put a lot of fixes so that it cannot be used from outside, but still there is a credential there also. So being aware that, yes, even though the credential is not exposed, if the system where the credential is used is exposed, still there could be an attack. Being aware of it, saying that what all avenues of things can be attack vectors are there is very important. So that's why there could be internal clients, there could be external clients, and you have to more emphasize on external, because this is my opinion, is security is like an onion peel, right? The harder you make the center of the thing to reach, that's what it is. You can protect it as much of it, but you have to keep protecting it so that the depth is there. If you leave only one layer, you peel it out, you are in the center, that's a problem. But if you put 10 layers, it's harder for somebody to get there, right? Because still you need some systems to do that because they need to access it. So, and also the other important thing is there is credential-based and there is trust-based. Now there is a concept of workload identity management, right? If you look at how SAML, OIDC and things evolve, now even for workloads, you can do that. You can trust systems to trust each other. For example, from AWS to another AWS, you can just establish a trust. But still there is a system which is accessing it. That means, let's say, as a third party, somebody is trusting our company and giving access. That means that I would be able to do things without any credentials. But there is a mutual understanding that these systems exchange between them to say that, okay, I'm going to talk to you and do. Even though there may not be a credential, there's still a threat vector. If my company gets attacked or somebody is in yours, the third party gets attacked, there is a possibility of doing it. So that is also something to consider when doing it. The only way you can figure out something is happening using a behavioral analysis, and also by restricting the IP addresses from which your access is happening. So those are the best practices when you're giving access to third party. Make sure that that comes from only specifically known IP addresses and also from the trusted parties. The most important thing in this whole thing is entitlements, which means that you have to protect what this can be done. That is access. I think it was well put saying that in the panel that it's not just managing security of secrets and things. It's about the holistic lifecycle management of that NHI. It doesn't apply to NHI. It's for HI, access control, using JIT for humans, for non-humans, making sure that the credentials, entitlements, and everything is correctly set so that it can be done. So each NHI, make sure they have least privilege. That means that I've seen CI systems given admin because people think that they don't know what it will do, so let me give admin. The problem is once somebody gets compromised, that NHI, it can use the full credential. So if you've given exactly what it needs, even if it gets compromised, right? Let's say as somebody said about read-only, they can read, but they cannot make any change, right? So being very clear about what that entity should know is very important. Again, there's another practice to reduce NHIs. People use the same NHIs in multiple applications. The behavioral analysis is very hard. If you don't know which application is doing what, you cannot reduce the privilege. So having a clear definition of 1:1 mapping between application and NHI is very critical. And then make sure that as much as possible, NHI don't have any admin level credentials, right? So that it cannot do any damage. So this is where you have full control as a client to manage, and it's your last level of defense, even if your credentials are compromised. So with that, I'll just talk about the key takeaways, right? Focus on what you can control. Everything is important. All the three aspects are important. But the most important is the entitlements, because that's where you have to spend time to think about it. Because it's not easy, because there is 17,000 permissions in AWS, right? Like 10,000 in GCP. It's not easy to know which ones are critical, but that's where there are systems to help you out, right? And make sure that entitlements are clearly adjusted to what it needs. Use short-lived credentials. Try to avoid as much as possible if it's our internal system or enterprise system. Wherever you cannot avoid, there is going to be definitely cases on a practical basis. You need to make sure it's protected, it's analyzed, the behavior is checked, and it's restricted as much as possible. Put it behind as much onion peel as possible. That's pretty much, I would say, where you want to prioritize. With that, basically an Andromeda Security is an identity platform, which is for both humans and non-humans, where we provide entire access management for humans through JIT and analysis and least privilege, and similarly for NHI, what is the right way to address them from a credentials as well as from a entitlement perspective. Thank you.